She came to Blackstone Ridge to find a husband. What she found instead was a grave with her name already carved on it. A woman dragged through frozen mud, a land claim worth a fortune, and the one man every outlaw in the territory feared, watching from the shadows. This is the story of Evelyn Hart, a woman they tried to bury alive. What they didn't count on was the mountain fighting back. If this story pulls you in, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The train arrived 40 minutes late, which meant Evelyn Hart had 40 extra minutes to talk herself out of the worst decision she'd ever made. She didn't use them well. She sat rigid in the rear car, her hands folded over the leather travel bag in her lap, like she was protecting something precious inside it, which, though she didn't fully understand it yet, she was. The bag held everything she owned, a change of clothes, a small tin of dried biscuits she'd been rationing since St. Louis, a bundle of letters tied with brown cord, and tucked beneath the false bottom her father had sewn in years ago, a folded document she barely understood but had been told, repeatedly, never to lose. The window beside her was frosted at the corners. Through the center, where the ice hadn't won yet, she watched Blackstone Ridge materialize out of the white nothing, like something the mountain had coughed up and forgotten about. It wasn't what she'd pictured. She wasn't proud of what she'd pictured. Something modest but promising. A main street with a few proper storefronts. People with coats that fit. Maybe a church with a real bell. The letters from Mr. Gerald Holt had painted a picture of a frontier community on the rise, a place where silver money was making respectable men out of rough ones, where a woman of good character and modest means could carve out a decent life. What she saw through the smeared window was a town that looked like it had been assembled in a hurry by people who expected to leave soon. Wooden buildings crowded together against the cold, none of them quite straight, like they were all leaning into each other for warmth. Smoke came from maybe half the chimneys. The main road, if you were generous enough to call it that, was a channel of gray slush between two lines of storefronts. A sign for a saloon had come half off its post and hung at a drunk angle. 3 horses stood hitched to a rail outside it, heads down, miserable. Evelyn pressed her forehead briefly against the cold glass. "You made a choice," she told herself. "Now you live with it." That had been her father's voice originally. He'd said it enough times that it had become a reflex, the way you reach for a wall in the dark. It wasn't comforting exactly, but it was honest, and she'd always preferred honest. The train lurched to a stop with a screech of metal that made half the car flinch. Around her, the other passengers began gathering themselves. A pair of businessmen who'd spent the whole journey talking about ore prices, a family with 3 children and too much luggage, and one enormous man in a canvas coat who hadn't spoken or moved in 6 hours, and made Evelyn vaguely uneasy. She waited until most of them had filed out before she stood. Old habit, smaller targets move last. The platform was worse than the view from the window. The cold hit her the moment she stepped off the train car, a sharp, personal cold that went straight through her wool coat like it wasn't there. Her breath came out in a white cloud. The platform boards were slick with ice, and she had to grab the rail with her free hand to keep her footing. She scanned the small crowd that had gathered to meet the train. Mostly men. A few women bundled so heavily they were just shapes. She was looking for Gerald Holt, who had described himself in his letters as a man of medium build and reliable appearance, usually wearing a brown felt hat. She had no photograph. She'd thought that was romantic once. The idea of recognizing someone from a description, like something out of a novel. Standing on the platform in the cold with a travel bag that was cutting into her palm, it mostly felt like a bad idea. She didn't see anyone who matched. She did notice several men noticing her. "Miss Hart?" The voice came from her left. She turned. The man who'd spoken was not Gerald Holt. Or if he was, Gerald Holt had been profoundly dishonest in his letters. This man was in his late 40s, thickly built in a way that had gone soft in the middle, with a red complexion that spoke of years of cold weather or years of whiskey, and possibly both. He wore a sheepskin coat that had seen better decades. His hat was black, not brown. "I'm Evelyn Hart," she said carefully. "Is Mr. Holt not—" "Gerald sends his apologies." The man smiled with his mouth. "Delayed on business. He asked me to collect you and bring you to the hotel. Get you settled." He reached for her bag. She didn't let go of it. His eyes dropped to her hands on the strap, then came back up to her face. The smile didn't change, but something behind it did. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't catch your name." "Del Ramsey." He said it like she should know it. She didn't. "Mr. Ramsey, I appreciate the gesture, but I'd prefer to wait for Mr. Holt himself. I don't mind the cold." That was a lie. She minded the cold enormously. Ramsey's smile finally moved. It got smaller and flatter. "Miss Hart, it's going to be dark in about 2 hours, and the temperature is going to drop another 20 degrees when it does. Gerald will meet you at the hotel. That's the arrangement." She looked at him for a moment. Behind him, she could see the last of the other passengers dispersing, being absorbed into the town or into waiting carriages. The platform was emptying. The enormous man in the canvas coat was already gone. "You made a choice." "All right," she said, and she followed him. The Blackstone Ridge Hotel occupied the widest building on the main street, which meant it was wider than a barn and about as comfortable. The lobby smelled of wood smoke, wet wool, and something Evelyn couldn't identify but didn't like. A thin man behind the desk didn't look up when they came in. Ramsey spoke to him briefly, got a key, and led Evelyn up a staircase that announced each step with a different groan. Her room was on the second floor. It had a bed, a chair, a window that looked out onto the alley, and a water basin with a thin film of ice on it. "Gerald will be here within the hour," Ramsey said from the doorway. He'd stopped smiling entirely. "Get yourself presentable." He pulled the door shut before she could respond. Evelyn stood in the middle of the room for a moment. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, which creaked but held. She took off her gloves. Her fingers were stiff and slow. She told herself to be reasonable. Men had business. Arrangements got disrupted. Gerald Holt had written her long, detailed letters over 6 months. Letters that were warm without being inappropriate, specific without being boastful, honest about the difficulties of frontier life, while also being clear about the opportunities. She'd checked what she could. She'd asked questions at the post office back in Millhaven, where his letters originated. She'd spoken to a woman who knew someone who'd done business with him. None of it was what you could call certainty. But then nothing in her life had offered certainty since her father died 2 years ago and left her with a parcel of frontier land she didn't know how to work and a stack of debts she didn't know how to pay. She opened her travel bag, checked the false bottom. The document was there, folded and dry. She'd asked the land office about it before she left. The man behind the counter had unfolded it carefully, held it up to the window light, and whistled softly through his teeth. "This is a registered mineral rights claim, Miss Hart. Your father filed it 3 years ago. Do you have any idea what's out there on that land?" She'd said no. Neither did anyone else, he'd said, until about 4 months ago. She refolded the document and pressed it back beneath the false bottom. The hour passed. Gerald Holt did not come. Another half hour. Nothing. She went to the door and opened it. The hallway was empty. From downstairs came the slow accumulation of saloon noise, voices, the clink of glasses, something that might have been music. She went back to the window. The alley below was dark now. The temperature had dropped exactly as Ramsey promised. She was hungry. She was tired. She was starting quietly to be afraid. The knock came at 7 o'clock. She'd imagined Gerald Holt so many times in 6 months that she'd accumulated several versions of him. She'd tried not to. But on long nights in the cold farmhouse after her father died, with the debts mounting and the land sitting useless and the letters from Holt arriving with their quiet suggestions of partnership and a future, she'd let herself imagine. None of the versions had looked like this. He was tall, which matched the letters, but tall like something had been stretched. His face was narrow with a long jaw and pale eyes that sat too close together, and when he smiled, which he did immediately, widely, there were too many teeth in it. "Miss Hart?" He took her hand before she offered it and pressed it briefly. His hand was dry and cold. "I'm so deeply sorry for the delay. Business in this town has a way of—" He shook his head, world-weary, pulling a man in 20 directions. "It's quite all right," she said. It wasn't, entirely, but she was trying to be fair. "You must be starving, and frozen." He stepped back from the doorway and gestured toward the stairs with a sweep of his arm. "I've taken the liberty of reserving a table downstairs. We have a great deal to discuss." The dining room was separated from the saloon by a partition that stopped about a foot short of the ceiling, which meant it separated them visually, but not in any other meaningful way. The table he'd reserved was in the corner, which she appreciated. She'd always liked corners. A woman brought them food without being asked. Stew that was mostly potatoes and a bread that was mostly crust. Evelyn ate carefully. Holt ate quickly and with appetite, and between bites he talked, and as he talked she listened with the particular focused attention she'd developed over years of listening to men who expected to be believed. He was charming. She'd grant him that. The letters had prepared her for it, but hearing it in person was something different. He had a way of leaning forward when he spoke, like whatever he was saying was just for you, like the whole world outside the table had dropped away. He made eye contact well. He laughed at the right moments and was quiet at the right moments, and the story he told was a good one. A man of business and moderate means who'd found his footing in the frontier economy and was looking now for something more permanent, something with a partner in it. She waited for the thing that would feel wrong. It came about 40 minutes in, over the second round of coffee, neither of them needed. "I'd like to move quickly on the ceremony," he said. "Given the season, travel becomes difficult in another few weeks, and I've already spoken to Judge Calver, who's agreeable to performing it. We could have everything settled by Saturday." Evelyn set her cup down. "That's 3 days?" "It is." He nodded, like 3 days was perfectly reasonable. "Your letters suggested the spring." "The spring was my original thinking, yes. But circumstances," he smiled, "accelerate." She studied his face. He held the smile comfortably, which was one of two things. Either he was completely at ease with the situation, or he was very good at looking that way. She wasn't sure yet which. "What circumstances?" she asked. The smile held. "Business opportunities. The kind that don't wait." She asked him 3 more questions over the next 20 minutes. Specific questions. About the property, about his associates, about the legal structures he'd mentioned in his letters. He answered all of them smoothly, without hesitation, without contradiction. It should have reassured her. Somehow, it didn't. When she finally said goodnight and went back upstairs, she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark room and turned it over in her mind. Nothing she could point to. Nothing definitive. Just the faint, persistent feeling. The one she'd learned to trust after her father died and 2 separate men had tried to acquire his debt on favorable terms for themselves. That something underneath the surface was moving. She didn't sleep well. The ceremony was scheduled for 10 in the morning at the office of Judge Calver, which occupied the back half of a building that primarily housed a dry goods store. 3 days was not enough time to know a man, but she'd spent those 3 days asking questions of anyone who would answer them. The bartender at the hotel knew Holt by sight, but not well. A woman at the post office had heard the name. One of the businessmen from the train, whom she encountered at the general store, told her that Holt had a reputation as a man who facilitated property transactions, which was vague enough to mean almost anything. She couldn't find a reason to leave. That was the thing she kept coming back to. She'd arrived in Blackstone Ridge with $17 in her pocket and a land claim she couldn't develop alone. The farm in Millhaven was gone, sold to cover the debts. She had no family left who would take her in without a price attached. Gerald Holt was, on the surface, offering her a legitimate way forward. You made a choice. She was still living with it. The morning of the ceremony was clear and brutal, the sky a hard white that promised nothing warm. She dressed carefully in the best thing she had, a gray dress she'd kept pressed in her bag, and gathered her documents. She was halfway down the stairs when she heard Ramsey's voice below. She stopped. He was talking to someone she couldn't see, his voice low and quick, and the words that came up the stairwell to her were, "Doesn't need to know until after the transfer." And then, "Harker wants it done before the end of the week." And then the name that would mean nothing to her now, but would mean a great deal before the day was over. Silas Harker. She came the rest of the way down the stairs slowly, her hand tight on the railing, her face arranged into a neutral expression she'd been practicing for years. Judge Calver was a small man with the permanent squint of someone who'd spent too many years reading bad handwriting in poor light. He stood behind a desk that was too big for him in a room that smelled of paper and tobacco, and he looked at Evelyn when she came in with the expression of a man who wanted to be somewhere else. Holt was already there. So was Ramsey. So was a third man she hadn't met, who stood in the corner with his arms crossed and his hat still on his head inside a building, which told her everything she needed to know about his manners and a fair amount about his character. Miss Hart. Holt extended his hand. He was wearing a good coat today, dark wool with brass buttons, and he'd done something to his hair. He looked, at 10 in the morning in the back of a dry goods store, almost like what he'd claimed to be. She shook his hand. The judge cleared his throat. Shall we begin? It was, start to finish, about 4 minutes. She answered when she was supposed to answer. She held herself still and kept her face composed and recited the words without quite hearing them. Because underneath the words, underneath the whole thin surface of the ceremony, something in her chest had gone cold and still, in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. When Calver said the final words, and she was, by the state of whatever territory this was, legally bound to Gerald Holt, she felt nothing. Not relief, not hope, not the terror she'd been tamping down for 3 days. Just the silence. And then Holt said quietly, almost gently, as Calver gathered his papers, I'll need the land claim now. She looked at him. His face had changed. Not dramatically. It wasn't a villain's sneer, nothing so clean as that. It was more like the mask was still there, but had shifted slightly, and through the gap she could see what was underneath it, and what was underneath it was nothing, just interest, flat and practical, the way you'd look at a tool you needed. The claim, she said. From my bag. From wherever you've been keeping it. He said it pleasantly, like they were discussing the weather. The man in the corner uncrossed his arms. Ramsey moved toward the door, not to leave through it, but to stand in front of it. Gerald, she said. She kept her voice even. What is this? A transaction, he said. You've fulfilled your role. The claim transfers with the marriage, which means it transfers now. The cold in her chest spread outward, through her arms and down into her hands. You arranged this to steal my land. I arranged this, he said, because a single woman cannot legally hold a registered mineral claim under the Blackstone Ridge Territorial Code. Marriage transfers the claim to the husband. He tilted his head slightly. Your father should have checked the statutes before he died. It was the casual way he said it that broke something open in her. Not cruelty exactly, more like indifference, the kind that's worse than cruelty because at least cruelty requires you to matter. She threw the water glass on Calver's desk. She didn't plan it. Her hand moved, and then the glass was in the air, and then it hit Holt across the cheekbone, which wasn't exactly what she'd aimed for, but was close enough. He swore sharply, and his hands came up, and she moved for the door because that was the only thing to do. And Ramsey caught her by the arm. He was stronger than he looked. The bag, Ramsey said to Holt, who was pressing his hand to his cheek. Take it. What happened next was not quick or clean. She fought. She was not trained to fight, and she was not large, and it made no practical difference against 2 men who'd made careers of managing reluctant situations. But she fought anyway, because the alternative was to go quietly, and she was done with quiet. They got the bag. They got the document inside it, or they thought they did. They got a document folded and tucked in the outer pocket, which was the copy. The one she'd started keeping as a decoy after the second night when she'd been certain something was wrong. The real one still flat against the false bottom. But they didn't know that. And she didn't tell them. What she told them, loudly, as Ramsey pulled her out through the back door of the judge's office and into the alley behind the main street, was exactly what she thought of all of them, in language her father would have been surprised she knew. The alley connected to the main street at both ends. By the time Ramsey got her outside, she'd been struggling for nearly 2 minutes, and her coat had come off one shoulder and her hair was down, and there was mud on her dress from the alley floor, gray-brown mud that stank of horse and ice melt. He pushed her, and she went down on her hands and knees in the mud. She heard voices. From somewhere on the main street, people were watching this. She could hear the quality of it, the silence of people watching something happen that they've decided isn't their business. She got up. Not gracefully. Her hand slipped twice. The mud was thick and cold, and her dress was ruined, and her palms were scraped raw. She got up anyway. Ramsey took a step toward her, and she held her ground, which was the wrong tactical decision and the only one she was capable of making at that moment. Give it up, he said, not unkindly. He'd gotten what he needed. He was in a generous mood. Walk away, Miss Hart. You get to keep your name and your health. That's a better deal than most. It's Mrs. Holt now, she said. Legally. He almost smiled at that. For however long Gerald keeps the paperwork, yes. That land claim is mine. It belonged to my father, and it passes to me. It passed to your husband 20 minutes ago. He said it flat, final. Go home. Wherever home is. I have no home. She said it without meaning to. The truth of it just came out, unguarded, and hung there in the cold air between them. Ramsay looked at her for a moment with something that might have been, briefly, discomfort. Then he turned and walked back through the alley door. She stood in the mud in a ruined dress on a side street in Blackstone Ridge, with $9 left in the inner pocket of her coat, and a land claim hidden in a false bottom, and no plan, and no ally, and no idea what to do next. The crowd on the main street, such as it was, dispersed. And then, from the deep shadow between the assay office and the hardware store across the alley, a figure stepped out. She saw the boots first. They were tall and dark-oiled, the kind made for hard ground and wet weather, with wear patterns that spoke of genuine miles. Then the heavy canvas pants, then the long canvas coat, open despite the cold, hanging off shoulders wide enough to suggest a person who'd spent years carrying things through terrain that didn't care if he got there. He was perhaps 35, though weather had a way of aging men in these mountains that made guessing uncertain. His face was rough-planed and angular, with a short beard that was more dark than not, and eyes that were a very pale gray, the color of the sky before snow, which she'd been looking at for 3 days and recognized. He had a rifle slung over one shoulder like it was part of his anatomy, and a skinning knife on his right hip that was as long as her forearm. He was looking at her, not at her condition, not at the mud, not at the general spectacle of a woman in a ruined dress in a cold alley, but at her specifically with an expression of focused assessment that she would later come to understand was simply how he looked at everything, directly and without performance. "You're bleeding," he said. She looked at her hands. The scrapes from the ground had opened up. Not badly, but there was red in the gray mud on her palms. "I noticed," she said. He didn't come closer. He stayed where he was, leaning his shoulder against the wall of the assay office, and studied her with that flat gray look. "How much did they take?" She looked at him. "Who are you?" "Someone who watched them drag you out of Calver's office." He said it without inflection, which answers the question of whether I should be asking it. "They took a document," she said carefully. "They believe it's a land claim." Something moved in his expression, just briefly. "Is it?" She met his eyes. "They believe it is." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Colton Vance." He didn't extend his hand. "I run trap lines on the North Ridge. I was in town to sell pelts." "Evelyn Hart." She paused. "Holt. Legally, at the moment." She hated how that tasted. "They married me to acquire the claim." "Holt," Vance said, and the flatness in his voice changed slightly, took on a different quality. "Gerald Holt. You know him." "I know who he works for." He looked past her, toward the main street, then back. "And if Gerald Holt just married you for a land claim, then whoever holds that land is already on a list." She wrapped her arms around herself against the cold she'd been ignoring. "What list?" He looked at her steadily. "The kind you don't come off of." The cold from outside and the cold from inside her chest met somewhere in the middle. "I have the real claim," she said quietly, "not what they took." He went very still for a moment. "You had 2 copies." "My father taught me to be careful." Vance was quiet for what felt like a long time. On the main street, a cart went past. Somewhere inside the saloon next door, a man laughed at something. "The man Holt works for," Vance said finally. "His name is Silas Harker. He's been acquiring mineral rights in this territory for 2 years by various means, some of them legal. When the legal ones stop working," he glanced at her ruined dress, "he finds other means." "Harker," she said, the name she'd heard on the stairs. "He has 12 men on payroll that I know of. Could be more." Vance pushed off the wall. "They're going to figure out fairly quickly that what they took isn't valid. When they do, they're going to come back for you." She stared at him. "They're going to need you to sign a proper transfer," he said, "or they're going to need you not to be in a position to contest one." He said it plainly, without drama, like he was describing weather. She understood him. She'd understood him before he finished saying it, because she'd been understanding things since she walked into Judge Calver's office and seen Ramsey's position in front of the door, but having it said out loud by a man she'd known for 3 minutes in a frozen alley was something different from knowing it in her chest. "So they'll come for me," she said. "Before dark, would be my guess." She looked down at her hands. The blood had dried. "Then I need to be somewhere else before dark." "Yes," he said. "You do." She looked up at him. His face was unreadable in the particular way of men who'd spent long periods alone in wilderness, men who'd stopped performing for audiences because there were no audiences. She couldn't tell what he was thinking or what he wanted or what his interest in this situation was. She asked him, "Why are you telling me any of this?" He was quiet for just a moment. "Because I watched 3 men manhandle a woman out of a courthouse in broad daylight, and not one person on that street did anything about it." He said it without heat, just as a fact that had bothered him. "And because I know what Silas Harker does to problems he can't solve paperwork." "What does he do?" "He buries them," Vance said. "Literally, in 2 cases that I know of personally." The silence between them was long and cold and full of wind. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked. "No," she said. "Any money?" $9. "Weapons?" "No." He nodded slowly, processing this inventory of what she did and didn't have. Then he tilted his head toward the end of the alley, away from the main street. "I have a cabin," he said. 12 miles north. Rough terrain." He said it like he was giving her all the relevant facts and leaving the decision to her, which was something she would later think about. The particular respect of being handed a choice instead of being guided toward one. "You'd be hard to follow there if we move in the right direction. I know 3 routes. Harker's men know one of them." She looked at him for a long moment. She'd been wrong before. She'd been wrong about Gerald Holt, and look where that had landed her. But she had $17.9 and no plan, and a criminal organization that was about to come looking for her. And she was standing in an alley in the cold in a ruined dress with mud-scraped hands, and the solitary useful thing she had in the world pressed flat against the false bottom of her bag. She thought about the name she'd heard on the stairs. Harker. And the word transfer. And the cold way Ramsey had told her she was getting a good deal when the deal he was describing was her disappearance. 12 miles, she said. On horseback. 3 hours in this weather. Longer if conditions change. She looked at the end of the alley, then back at him. "I'll need gloves," she said. Mine got left in Calver's office." He reached into his coat pocket without comment and pulled out a pair of heavy leather work gloves lined with something dark and soft, and held them out. They were enormous on her. She put them on anyway. "All right," she said. "Let's go." He had 2 horses at the livery stable, a big gray that was his, heavy through the shoulders and used to mountain terrain, and a rented bay that the stablemen released without argument when Vance said 3 quiet words to him that Evelyn didn't catch. She didn't ask. She was learning, in the rapid compressed way of people whose circumstances require quick adaptation, how to read what mattered and let the rest go. They left Blackstone Ridge by the North Road and then left the North Road almost immediately, cutting east through a stand of pines where the snow was unbroken and the silence was total. The cold deepened as the trees closed around them. She could see her breath and the horse's breath and nothing much else. She rode adequately. Not well. She'd grown up on a farm, but it was a flat country farm, not mountain terrain, and there was a difference between sitting a horse on flat ground and following a man through snow-covered slopes where the footing was uncertain and the incline changed without warning. The bay was patient with her, which helped. Vance rode ahead. He didn't speak much, which she initially took for unfriendliness and later understood as simply how he moved through terrain, focused, economical, attentive to the things she wasn't yet trained to notice. The way a bird flushed from a branch ahead of them, the specific quality of shadow between 2 trees, the faint track marks in the snow that he steered them carefully around. After about an hour, he stopped on a ridgeline and turned to look back down through the trees at the valley where Blackstone Ridge sat small and smoky below them. He looked at it for a moment without expression. 2 riders left town about 20 minutes after we did, he said. Southwest Road. Wrong direction. That's good? For now. He turned the gray and kept moving. She followed. She had a lot of time in the saddle to think, which was not entirely a gift. She thought about the letters, 6 months of them, each one careful and specific and warm, and she tried to identify the moments where she should have known. She couldn't, quite, which was more disturbing than finding them would have been. He'd been good. He'd been very good. She thought about her father. He'd homesteaded that land 20 years ago, worked it alone for most of that time, added the mineral claim 3 years before he died when a surveyor friend had told him quietly that the formation under the eastern ridge looked interesting. He'd never in his life had enough money to develop it. He'd died of a chest illness one December with the debts not quite paid and the land sitting fallow and the claim filed away in a box under his bed. She'd found the claim when she was clearing the house. She hadn't understood what it was exactly. She'd kept it because it was his. She kept it tucked against the false bottom all the way up the mountain. Tucked. They arrived at the cabin just as the last gray light was going out of the sky. It was not what she'd imagined when he said cabin. She'd imagined something rough but temporary, a single room with a cot and a fire. What she found was a low, solid structure built into the slope of the mountain itself, half sheltered by a rock overhang that kept the roof clear of heavy snow. There was a separate lean-to for the horses, a woodpile under canvas that was taller than she was, and a root cellar dug into the hillside whose door Vance opened briefly to check before he did anything else. Inside was a main room with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall, a table, 2 chairs, a cot along one wall, and a sleeping loft above. Shelves with organized provisions. A gun rack with 3 rifles and a shotgun, all clean. Traps hanging from pegs near the door, sorted by size. It was, she realized, the home of someone who actually lived here. Not a camp. A home. She stood in the middle of it while he started the fire, and the warmth began to move through the room, and she thought about the fact that she'd been in Blackstone Ridge for 3 days and had come away from them with nothing but a ruined dress, scraped hands, and a land claim hidden in a bag. "Sit down," he said, without looking up from the fire. "You're still shaking." "I'm not." She sat down. She was, a little. It had been a long day. He made coffee, real coffee, not the brown water she'd been getting at the hotel, and set a mug on the table in front of her without ceremony, then sat across from her and wrapped his hands around his own mug and looked at her with those gray eyes. "The document," he said. "The real one." She reached into the bag, found the false bottom, pulled out the folded paper and laid it flat on the table. He leaned forward. "Read it slowly and carefully, without touching it." When he finished, he sat back. "Heart mining claim," he said. "Eastern Ridge, Blackstone Territory. Filed 3 years ago." "My father's. I know the ridge." His voice was different, quieter, but with something underneath it. "I trapped the northern face. I know every formation up there." He paused. "Last spring, a survey team came through. Private company. I watched them from the upper ridge with a glass for 3 days." She looked at him. "What were they doing?" "Taking core samples," he said. "From your father's claim." The room was warming now. Outside, the wind had picked up, pressing against the walls of the cabin with a low sound. "How much?" she said. He looked at her levelly. "If the formation runs where the survey team was drilling?" "Yes." "Enough to run a serious mining operation for 20 years, he said. "Maybe more." The fire crackled. The wind pushed at the walls. "That's why he wants it," she said. Not a question. "That's why he wants it," Vance said. "And that's why he needs you gone." She looked at the document on the table, her father's handwriting on the registration line. His signature, cramped and careful. The signature of a man who'd never been entirely comfortable with pen and paper. "They'll come here," she said. "Eventually." He picked up his coffee. "We have some time. Maybe 2 days before they work out what they took isn't valid. Then they'll look for you seriously, and some of Harker's men know these mountains." He paused. "Some of them. Not all of them. Not all of them." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I know things about this mountain. They don't." She looked across the table at a man she'd known for 4 hours. He'd given her gloves and gotten her out of town and made her coffee and showed her a document that told her she was worth killing for. "What do you get out of this?" she asked. He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. "I've been watching Silas Harker operate in this territory for 2 years, he said. "He took a man's homestead 3 valleys over by forging documents. The man had a wife and 4 children. He stopped. "I watched that family leave with what they could carry in one cart." She waited. "I didn't do anything about it," he said, "because it wasn't my fight, and I had no grounds. And there's nothing in these mountains that gives a man legal standing to walk into someone else's trouble." He looked at the fire. "Today you were standing in an alley. You had $9 and no plan, and you'd already figured out the most important thing, that the document they took wasn't the real one." He glanced back at her. "That's not nothing. That's the kind of thinking that might actually matter." She held his gaze. "You're saying you want to help me?" "I'm saying," he said carefully, "that I'm already involved, and that the next few days are going to require both of us to be smarter than the men who are coming." Outside, the wind sharpened. Snow began to tick against the cabin's single window, small, hard pellets of it, the kind that meant serious weather was building on the upper ridge. Evelyn Hart picked up the land claim and folded it back along its original creases and tucked it back into the false bottom of her bag. "Then we should probably make a plan," she said. Colton Vance set down his coffee. "We should probably make several," he said. The fire burned low and steady through the long first night on the mountain, and outside the snow came down harder, and somewhere below them in the dark valley, the men who'd been sent to solve the problem of Evelyn Hart were beginning to realize that the problem was more complicated than they'd been told. The snow that had started as small hard pellets against the window by the time they'd finished their coffee had turned, by midnight, into something with real intentions behind it. Evelyn lay on the cot in the main room. Vance had taken the loft without discussion, which she appreciated, listening to it work against the cabin walls, and she didn't sleep for a long time. She wasn't afraid of the storm. She'd grown up with Midwestern winters that had their own particular violence, the kind that came flat across open ground with nothing to stop it. This was different, heavier, more deliberate somehow, but it wasn't what was keeping her awake. What was keeping her awake was arithmetic. She kept running through it. 2 days, he'd said. Maybe 2 days before Harker's men worked out that the document they'd taken from her bag was a copy, a very good copy. The land office man back in Millhaven had made it from the original on proper paper with proper ink, but a copy nonetheless, lacking the original registry seal her father had pressed into the bottom right corner with a notary's stamp he'd borrowed and never quite returned. 2 days before they came looking for the real one, before they came looking for her. Against that, one man who knew the mountain, one woman who was learning fast out of necessity, a cabin that was solid but not a fortress, and a land claim worth enough money to make serious men do serious things. She'd faced worse arithmetic than this, technically. When her father died and the debts came in all at once like they'd been waiting politely and were now done waiting, the numbers had been just as impossible and the resources just as thin. She'd sold what could be sold, paid what could be paid, let go of what she had to let go of, and kept the one thing that mattered. She was still keeping it. At some point, the arithmetic became repetitive, and she fell asleep without meaning to. And when she woke, it was gray light and the storm had passed and someone was making noise at the stove. Vance was already up, already dressed, already moving with the economy of a man whose mornings had a shape to them built by years of routine. He had coffee on and something in the pan that smelled like salt pork, and he didn't look up when she sat up from the cot. "Snow stopped around 4, he said, 8 inches on the flat, more on the upper slope." She pushed her hair back from her face. It was a disaster. She didn't have a brush. She'd left everything in the hotel room except what was in the bag, and the bag had not included the things a woman considered essential when she'd believed she was traveling toward a respectable marriage rather than away from an attempted murder. "Does the snow help us or hurt us?" she asked. He thought about it while he turned whatever was in the pan. "Both. Covers our tracks from yesterday. Also means anyone coming up from the valley is going to have a harder time of it." He paused. "Also means I need to check my trap line or I lose 3 days' work." She looked at him. "You're going out?" "This morning, yes." He set a plate on the table. "You're coming with me." She opened her mouth and he added before she could say anything, "You can't stay here alone. Not yet. If someone gets to the cabin while I'm on the line, you don't know the terrain well enough to run." She closed her mouth. He was right, which was irritating, but he was right. She ate standing on the table while he laid out what they'd need for the morning. He was organized in a way that she recognized as functional rather than fastidious. Everything in its place not for the sake of tidiness, but because in country like this you needed to find things fast and in bad conditions, and clutter got people killed. He handed her a coat from a peg near the door, a heavy canvas thing like his own that was too big in the shoulders and too long in the arms. "Whose is this?" she asked. "Mine. Extra one." He didn't elaborate. She put it on. It smelled of wood smoke and pine resin and faintly of something animal she couldn't identify. She rolled the sleeves up. They went out into a world that had been remade overnight. The snow had filled every hollow and rounded every edge, and the morning light came off it sideways and white. And the silence was the complete silence of a wilderness that had settled back into itself after weather. Her breath came out in long white plumes. The cold was deep and still, the kind that didn't move, that just sat there and waited. Vance moved through the snow with the practiced ease of someone for whom this was simply Tuesday. She followed, lifting her feet higher than felt necessary because the snow was deeper than it looked, and she'd already gone in above the knee twice before she learned the lesson. He didn't say anything about it. He just waited the 2 seconds it took her to pull herself out and kept moving. The trap line ran in a long arc across the northern face of the ridge, and he moved it in a pattern she couldn't yet predict, stopping at locations she couldn't yet read. At each one he worked quickly and efficiently, resetting, relocating when the sign was wrong, moving on. She watched and tried to understand the logic of it, because understanding the logic of things had always been how she managed situations she couldn't control. "How do you know where to set?" she asked after the 4th stop. He glanced back at her. Most men, when they taught things, had a particular tone to them, slightly elevated, slightly patient, slightly condescending in the way of someone who knows something you don't and is aware of knowing it. He didn't have that. He answered like she'd asked a reasonable question that deserved a real answer. "Sign," he said. "Track patterns, rub marks, feeding areas. You learn what each animal does by habit, and you put the set in the habit's path." He indicated a depression in the snow to his left, a faint trail leading toward a stand of low brush. "Snowshoe hare runs that line every night. Consistent. You set for consistent." She looked at the trail. She couldn't see what he saw. "And if they change?" "They don't usually, not unless something pushes them." He moved toward the next set. "People change. Animals are more honest." She followed him. "That's a low opinion of people." "It's an accurate one." He glanced at her sideways. "Present company included, probably." She almost laughed at that. She hadn't expected to almost laugh today. "Fair enough," she said. They were 3/4 of the way through the line when he stopped without warning and held up one hand. She stopped immediately because she'd been paying attention to him the way you pay attention to something that knows its environment and you don't. He was looking up the slope to the east. She looked too and saw nothing, just snow and trees and sky. Then she heard it, very faint, the sound of something moving through snow at a pace that wasn't the sound of an animal. Vance turned and put his mouth close to her ear. 2 men, upper tree line, moving slow, watching down. His voice was barely a sound. "Don't look directly, keep moving like we didn't hear." She kept moving. It took everything she had. "They're not close enough to identify us," he said, still barely above nothing, still walking. "Not in these coats from that distance, but we need to be off this slope in the next 10 minutes. "Where?" "Rock formation, northeast. Follow my exact steps." She followed his exact steps. He moved differently now, still deliberate, but with a new quality to it, a specific directional intention that didn't look like urgency from a distance, but covered ground with purpose. She matched him as closely as she could, stepping where he stepped, keeping the same pace. The rock formation he'd mentioned turned out to be a cluster of granite outcroppings half buried in snow, jutting from the slope at angles that created natural shadows and sightlines. He led her into the deepest of the shadows and stopped, and they stood pressed against cold granite while he watched the upper tree line with eyes that she was beginning to understand were built for this specific kind of attention. She was breathing hard from the pace. She worked to quiet it. "Still moving east," he said after a minute. "They're not tracking us specifically. Survey sweep." He was quiet a moment more. "Looking for sign of the cabin." "Do they know where it is?" "They know roughly where I live. Del Ramsey has probably told them that much." He kept watching. "They don't know the terrain well enough to find it in the snow without a trail to follow. And we didn't leave one. I came down a different way this morning specifically." He finally looked away from the slope, looked at her. You're calm. She blinked. I'm terrified. You're terrified and you're calm, he said. That's different from just calm. That's actually useful. She didn't know what to do with that, so she didn't do anything with it. How do we get back? Circle north, come down through the creek drainage, longer. Takes us out of their sight line. He was already moving. Stay close. She stayed close. The longer route took nearly an hour, and by the time the cabin came in sight, she was wet to the thigh from a creek crossing that had been less frozen than it looked, and her feet were numb, and she was operating on the particular stubborn energy that kicks in when the other kinds run out. Vance didn't slow his pace for any of it, but he also didn't push it beyond what she could match, which she noticed. Inside the cabin, he got the fire back up while she changed into the dry set of clothes from her bag, her one other set, which she was now going to have to treat with extreme care. And when she came back out, he was at the table with a hand-drawn map spread out, marking something with a stub of pencil. She sat across from him and looked at the map. It was detailed in a way that told her he'd drawn it himself over time. Not all at once, but accumulated. Sections added as he'd moved through terrain, notes in small cramped writing at the margins. They know I'm here, she said. They suspect it. There's a difference. He marked a position. But they'll confirm it soon enough, and when they do, they'll come in numbers. She leaned over the map. Then we shouldn't be here when they do. He looked at her. Where would you go? The land claim needs to be registered with the Federal Land Office. Not the territorial one, the federal one, in Iron Creek. She put her finger on the map. If it's federally registered, Harker can't contest it through territorial courts. He doesn't have federal connections. Vance was quiet, studying her. How do you know he doesn't have federal connections? I don't know it for certain, but his operation is territorial. The way Ramsey talked about the statute, the one about women not holding mineral claims, that's territorial law. It doesn't hold federally. She looked up at him. My father knew that. That's why he used a federal form when he filed originally, but the federal registration lapsed when he died because I didn't know it needed renewal. He sat back slowly. If I'm right, getting that claim federally re-registered makes it untouchable. Harker would have to come after me openly in a federal jurisdiction, and whatever else he is, he's not stupid enough to do that. Vance looked at the map. She watched him think through it, and she could see him doing it, running terrain, running risk, running logistics, without any of it showing on his face except in the slight movement of his eyes. Iron Creek is 4 days on horseback, he said, in summer conditions. Right now, in snow, through passes that may or may not be open. He shook his head. 6 days minimum, possibly more. Can we make it? I've made longer crossings in worse conditions. He tapped the map at a point to the northwest. There's a route through the Calder Pass that Harker's men don't know, longer but safer, and there are 2 way stations I've used, not official, just shelters I know of. That's the route then. He looked at her. Something in his expression was doing a small, quiet thing she couldn't read exactly. You're already decided. I've been decided since last night, she said. I was just waiting to see if you'd see it too. He made a sound that might have been the very beginning of a laugh, cut short. We leave tomorrow morning, before light. He pulled the map back toward him. Today you're going to learn how to use a rifle. She looked at the gun rack. I've shot a rifle. On a farm. At what? She thought about it honestly. Rats, mostly. One time a dog that was killing chickens. Did you hit them? The dog. On the first shot? Pause. Third. He nodded like this was useful data, not a failure. Today we work on the first shot, he said. Because if something happens on the trail and I'm not in a position to handle it, you need to be able to. She looked at him steadily. And if you're not in a position to handle it, what does that mean? He held her gaze without flinching. It means something happened to me, he said, and you'll need to handle it yourself. That's what it means. The bluntness of it landed like a stone dropped on a table. She appreciated it. She was so tired of men who softened things into shapes that didn't hold up under inspection. All right, she said. Show me the first shot. They spent the afternoon on the eastern side of the cabin, where a natural backstop of rock and snow made a reasonable range, and she fired until her shoulder ached and her ears rang and she could put 3 shots out of 5 into a target the size of a man's chest at 40 yards. He corrected her grip twice and her breathing once, and said nothing else instructional, just watched, and occasionally said again in a tone that was not unkind. At the end of it, she lowered the rifle and her arms were shaking from the sustained effort and the cold, and she turned to find him looking at her with that gray, steady gaze. "Better," he said. "How much better?" "Enough to matter." He took the rifle back. "Come inside, we need to pack." They packed carefully and methodically. Provisions weighed against what the horses could carry, against what 6 days of mountain travel required, which meant decisions about what got left behind and what didn't. He knew the calculation precisely. She watched how he made it and tried to internalize the logic of it, the particular frontier arithmetic of weight versus necessity versus the genuine possibility of conditions changing. She repacked her own bag last. Checked the false bottom. The claim was there, dry, intact, her father's signature still clear in the fading winter light that came through the cabin's single window. She held it for a moment. Her father had filed this claim in a small land office in a town she'd never been to, on a form he'd borrowed from a friend, because a surveyor had told him the formation looked promising, and he'd had enough stubbornness in him to believe that something he owned might actually, someday, be worth owning. He'd never seen a penny from it. He'd died in December in a cold farmhouse with the debt not paid and this piece of paper in a box under his bed. She folded it back along its lines. "You made a choice," she thought, and then corrected herself. "He made a choice. You're living it." That felt different. That felt like something that was hers to carry forward rather than just carry. "Get some sleep," Vance said from across the room, without looking up from the pack he was tying. "We start at 4. She lay down on the cot. Outside, the temperature was dropping again. She could feel it in the walls, the particular tightening of cold wood. Somewhere far down in the valley, in Blackstone Ridge, a man named Silas Harker was presumably looking at a piece of paper that wasn't what he thought it was, and arriving at conclusions she needed to be ahead of. She thought about the 2 riders she'd seen on the slope that morning, moving slow, watching down, looking for sign. They'd be back, with more men and better information and the kind of determination that a fortune in silver purchased. She thought about the route north through Calder Pass. 6 days, maybe more. She thought about her father's handwriting on a registration form, cramped and careful. The handwriting of a man making a bet he never lived to collect. Sleep came eventually, not gently, but it came. And at 4 in the morning, in the deep mountain dark with the stars hard and clear overhead and the snow blue-white and silent in every direction, Colton Vance woke her with a quiet knock on the cabin wall, and Evelyn Hart got up, and they loaded the horses in the cold, and they rode north into the mountain dark before the first light had touched anything. Behind them, 2 hours later, 3 riders came up the slope from the south and found the cabin empty and the fire ash cold, and stood in the middle of the single room and looked at each other with the expressions of men who understood that their job had just gotten considerably harder. The Calder Pass in winter was not a route so much as an argument you made with the mountain, and the mountain reserved the right to reject your case at any point without notice. Vance had warned her the first morning when the dark was still total and the stars were the only light, and their breath came out in white clouds that hung in the still air before dissolving. He'd said, "The pass has moods. You read them, or you don't get through." She'd filed that away with everything else he'd told her, and hadn't asked what reading a mood looked like, because she'd decided the most efficient way to survive the next 6 days was to watch him and learn the vocabulary of this place through observation rather than instruction. The first day was the hardest, in the way that first days usually are. Not because the terrain was the worst, but because her body hadn't yet understood what was being asked of it. Her thighs ached from the grade. The cold worked into her hands despite the heavy gloves. The bay horse was steady and patient, but the slope demanded a constant small negotiation between horse and rider, a continuous adjustment she hadn't needed on flat ground. And by the time Vance called a halt in the early afternoon at a rock shelf that broke the wind, she was tired in a way that went all the way through. She didn't say so. She got down from the horse, walked it in a small circle to keep it moving like he'd shown her, and ate half a biscuit, and drank water from the canteen that was already developing a skin of ice around the inside of the lid. He watched her from across the rock shelf without comment, not checking on her, just watching, the way he watched everything, the continuous low-level attention of someone for whom awareness was not a choice but a survival tool. "Say it," she said. He raised an eyebrow. Whatever you're thinking, just say it. He looked at her for a moment. I was thinking you move better on a slope than you did yesterday morning. She hadn't expected that. One morning of practice. Some people don't adapt that fast. He said it as a plain fact, not a compliment, which was why it landed like one. You compensate well when something's harder than expected. She looked at the canteen in her hands. I've had practice compensating. He nodded once and looked away, out over the valley they'd climbed above. She followed his gaze. Below them, impossibly far below, the country they'd left spread out in white and gray and the dark lines of tree stands, enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the specific way of things that have no opinion of you whatsoever. Can they follow us up here? She asked. Ramsey knows I use the Calder route. He doesn't know the specific line I take through it. He squinted at the slope above them. There's a narrow section about 2 hours ahead, one way through, and it's not obvious unless you know it. Once we're past that, we're harder to track. And until then? He looked back down the slope the way they'd come. We move, he said simply, and got back on the gray. She got back on the bay. The narrow section he'd mentioned turned out to be a traverse across a face of rock and ice that was maybe 4 feet wide at its broadest point, with a drop on the left that she looked at once and then deliberately did not look at again. The horses did not like it. The gray went first, following Vance's steady hands and his quiet, specific voice, not soothing exactly, more instructional, telling the horse where the foot was going next, and made it across in a series of careful steps that took about 3 minutes and felt considerably longer. The bay was worse. It stopped at the entrance to the traverse and planted itself with the absolute conviction of an animal that has made a decision and considers the matter closed. Vance came back across, which involved more of the face than she'd have liked to watch, and took the bay's bridle and talked to it in the same quiet, instructional tone. And eventually the horse moved, 1 foot and then another, and she focused on the rock face 2 inches from her right knee and kept her weight centered and didn't think about the drop. When they reached the other side, she let out a breath that had been waiting for about 4 minutes. Well done, Vance said. To me or the horse? Both. She almost smiled. Her hands were shaking slightly inside the gloves. She pressed them against the saddle until they stopped. They made camp that first night in a hollow below a granite overhang that cut the wind and held a small fire's heat better than open ground would have. He'd used it before. There was old ash in the fire ring, a small stack of wood someone had cached under a ledge. He added to the stack from deadfall he'd collected on the way in, and she helped without being asked, which he noticed and didn't comment on. The fire was small by necessity, small enough not to throw light that carried, and they ate in the close warmth of it, dried meat and hardtack and the last of the salt pork from the cabin. She'd stopped being particular about food somewhere around the 2nd hour of riding. Tell me about Harker, she said. He looked across the fire at her. He had a tin cup of water he was warming his hands on. What do you want to know? Everything that matters. He thought about it. He came into this territory about 3 years ago. Started small. Bought legitimate claims, ran legitimate operations. Fast enough to make money, careful enough not to make enemies too quickly. He turned the cup in his hands. Then the legitimate claims ran thin, and the money had gotten big enough that waiting for legitimate opportunities felt like waste. So he started taking what wasn't offered, started arranging circumstances. He set the cup down. The homestead I told you about, the family they pushed out, that was the 3rd or 4th by the time I heard about it. He'd done the same thing twice before with smaller parcels. Forged transfer documents, bought off the right official, moved fast enough that by the time anyone wanted to contest it, there was no mechanism left to contest it through. She thought about the territorial statute Holt had cited. A single woman cannot legally hold a registered mineral claim. He researches the law. He has a lawyer, sharp man named Creed, who finds the specific holes and tells Harker exactly where to put the knife. Vance looked at the fire. Your situation. The marriage scheme. That's Creed's work. Too careful to be improvised. How many people has he actually hurt, physically? The fire popped. A log settled. 2 men I know of, found in the spring thaw, Vance said. Both had contested claims he wanted. Both deaths ruled as accidents. He paused. In this territory, with the right judge, accident is a flexible category. She sat with that. The cold outside the fire's small circle pressed in with more weight than it had a moment ago. He won't stop at intimidation, she said. It wasn't a question. Not with what's on that claim. No. He looked at her directly. The silver deposit your father's land sits on top of, if the survey I watched last spring was working the right formation, we're talking about enough money to buy a senator, maybe two. He said it flat. Men who can buy senators don't leave loose ends. She thought about her father in the cold farmhouse, filing a claim in a borrowed form, believing in something that might amount to something someday. He'd been right, and he'd never known it. And now his daughter was sitting at a small illegal fire on the side of a mountain that was trying to kill her, and being hunted by men who wanted to kill her, and everything that had put her here started with a piece of paper in a box under his bed. He should have known, she said, almost to herself. Your father? He should have lived to know it was real. She stared at the fire. He spent 20 years on that land working it with nothing, and the one thing he did that was worth something. She stopped. Vance was quiet. He didn't fill the silence with the things people usually filled it with, the reassurances, the redirections toward silver linings. He just let it be what it was. After a while, she said, I'm going to get it registered, whatever it takes to get to Iron Creek. I know, he said, and I'm going to make sure Harker can't touch it. I know that too. He picked up the cup again. Get some sleep. The second day is harder than the first. She lay down wrapped in the bedroll he'd packed for her. Heavier than she'd have chosen herself, she'd have underestimated. And the fire burned low and the cold held itself at a respectful distance, and she slept. He was right about the second day. The grade steepened as they climbed toward the pass proper, and the snow deepened with it, and around mid-morning the wind came back with something personal about it, pushing hard from the northwest and driving crystals of ice horizontally into anything that faced into it. She learned to read his shoulders for when the wind was about to shift. He always knew, some fraction of a second before it changed, from something she couldn't yet detect, and she angled the bay accordingly. They were an hour below the pass when she first noticed the sound. It was faint enough that she nearly dismissed it as wind noise, as the 100 different sounds the mountain made that weren't anything specific. But it came in a pattern that wind didn't use, and she pulled up the bay and listened. Vance had already stopped. He was facing back down the slope, completely still, his pale eyes moving across the terrain below in a slow, methodical sweep. 3, he said. Maybe 4. Her heart dropped about 3 inches. How close? Half a day behind. He calculated something she couldn't see. They're moving faster than I'd expected. Someone knows this terrain. Ramsey? Ramsey, or someone he hired who knows the northern routes. He turned forward and urged the gray upward. We need to be through the pass and down the other side before they get eyes on us across the open section. The open section was what he called the final approach to the pass itself, a long exposed bowl below the actual gap, treeless and white, and offering no cover in any direction. If anyone with a rifle was on the heights opposite when they crossed it, the situation simplified considerably in the wrong direction. She didn't ask how long it would take to cross. She pushed the bay to match the gray's pace, which the bay did with only moderate objection, and she kept her eyes on Vance's back and moved. The wind in the bowl was a different thing from the wind on the slope below. It came from the gap above with a concentrated force, pushing against them like something intentional, and the horses leaned into it and struggled, and she leaned forward over the bay's neck and kept her face down and just moved. It took 40 minutes to cross the bowl. It felt like considerably more. On the other side of the pass, the world changed. The slope ran north and down, sheltered from the wind that had been killing them for the past hour, and the silence that replaced it was so sudden and complete it felt strange. Different country on this side, darker timber, steeper gullies, the terrain more broken and complex. Vance stopped on the first flat ground below the gap and turned to look back up at the pass. She came up beside him and looked too. Nothing moving up there yet. The gap was clear. How long? She asked. An hour, maybe less. He was already looking at the terrain ahead. There's a way station about 3 miles north. Used to be a survey camp. It's abandoned now. We can shelter there tonight and they won't know it exists. Are you certain they won't know? He glanced at her. No, he said honestly, but it's the best option. She was learning to accept best options for what they were. The way station was a single room built from rough timber, half buried in the hillside like the cabin, but smaller and cruder, without the years of careful maintenance that had made the cabin livable. The door hung off one hinge. 2 of the 4 walls were solid. The other 2 were solid enough, and the small iron stove in the corner was functional once Vance cleared the flue of a bird's nest that had been there since at least the previous spring. She fed and watered the horses while he got the stove going, carrying snow in the tin bucket she found hanging on the exterior wall and melting it on the stove for the horses to drink from. The bay was tired. She could feel it in the way the horse stood, weight slightly off the right foreleg. And she spent extra time on it, checking the hoof, finding nothing wrong but bruising from the rock traverse that would need rest. "She's sore," she told Vance when she came back in. He nodded. He'd already suspected it. She could tell from his expression. "We rest an extra hour tomorrow morning. Let her come around." "Does that cost us?" He stirred whatever he had on the stove. "A little, not critically." He looked at her. "You noticed it before I asked." "I grew up with horses." "You said farm horses." "Farm horses still go lame." She sat on one of the rough benches that ran along the intact wall. "And when a horse goes lame on a farm, you don't have money to replace it, so you learn to notice early." He handed her a tin cup with broth in it, the remains of dried stock and something from his pack, and sat across from her. The stove was putting out real heat now, and the small space was warming, and outside the wind had found them even on this sheltered side of the pass, and was working at the door's broken hinge. "My mother lost a horse one winter," he said, unexpectedly. It was the first unprompted thing he'd offered about himself in 2 days. "Only one we had. It was February, and there was no replacing it, and the spring plowing—" He stopped, drank from his cup. "We did the plowing by hand. Her and me and my older brother. Took 3 weeks. She looked at him. He was looking at the stove. "How old were you?" 11? He said it simply, no performance of difficulty around it. "Where was your father?" "Gone." Equally simple. "He left when I was 8. My mother said he went west, and maybe he did." He turned the cup in his hands. "She never looked for him." "Did you?" "For a while. When I was younger." He looked up at her. Stopped eventually. Some questions aren't worth carrying. She thought about her own father and the 20 years he'd spent on ground that turned out to be worth a fortune he never saw. She thought about how long she'd carried the particular question of whether he'd have done anything differently if he'd known. "I think the carrying is sometimes less about the answer," she said, "and more about not knowing what else to hold." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yeah." He said it like she'd named something he'd been looking at sideways for years without finding the right angle. "That's probably right." Outside, the wind pushed the broken door and it swung on its one good hinge and swung back. The stove ticked with heat. The horses were quiet in the makeshift shelter he'd rigged with rope and canvas from the pack. She was thinking about the men behind them in the pass, an hour back when they'd cleared the gap, moving fast, according to Vance, someone among them who knew the terrain. "The man with them who knows this country," she said. "Who would Harker hire? Who knows the northern routes?" Vance set his cup down. He'd been thinking about it too. She could tell from the way he answered without a pause. "There are 3, maybe 4 men I know of who've worked these passes for long enough to navigate them in winter. One of them, a man named Burl Ashford. He's done work for Harker before. Scouting work, mostly." He paused. "Ashford is good. He doesn't cut corners, and he doesn't get lost. So he'll find the pass crossing. He'll see we went north." "Yes." "And the way station?" Vance looked at the door, the one that kept moving in the wind. "Ashford spent a winter up here 7, 8 years ago. Survey work for a different company." He picked up the cup again. "I can't tell you with certainty whether he knows this place exists." She absorbed that. "So we might have a night here, or we might have less." "We keep a watch," he said. "I'll take first. Wake you at 2. She didn't argue about taking a watch, which she could see surprised him slightly. She just asked, "What am I listening for?" "Horses on the slope below. Sound carries up here at night. The cold makes it travel further. Anything that sounds like more than one animal moving with intention." He looked at her. "If you hear it, wake me. Don't wait to be certain." "I'll wake you," she said. She slept from 8 until 2 when he touched her shoulder, and she came up out of the sleep fast and clean, which was something she hadn't known she could do before this week. He handed her the rifle and the position near the door and went to the bunk on the wall and was asleep inside of 5 minutes with the specific efficiency of someone who'd learned to sleep in segments because his life had required it. She sat in the dark near the broken door and listened to the mountain. It was not quiet, the mountain at night. It made sounds she was learning to categorize. Wind through specific configurations of rock that produced a specific pitch. Snow settling off a loaded branch with a sound like a muffled shot. The distant and occasional crack of ice under its own pressure. She filed each sound as she heard it, built a mental map of what the normal noise of this hillside at this hour sounded like. At 3:15, she heard something that didn't fit the map. Below, east of their position. Not horses. Something smaller, more cautious. A single animal moving carefully through snow with the light, deliberate footfall of something that didn't want to be heard. She put her hand on Vance's shoulder. He was awake before she'd finished the motion. He was at the door in 4 seconds, listening. The sound came again, closer. He put his mouth close to her ear. "Mountain lion," he said, working the gully below, following the horses. She let out a breath. "Could also use it as cover," he added quietly. "Anyone moving up behind it would be hard to hear." He stayed at the door for another 10 minutes. Nothing else came. "Go back to sleep," he said finally. "I'll stay up." She went back to the bunk. She did not sleep. She lay still and kept her ears open until the gray light started to show at the cracks in the door, and she heard Vance moving at the stove and smelled coffee, and then she got up. Neither of them spoke much in the morning. They packed efficiently, saddled the horses, gave the bay extra time like he'd promised before they moved. The animal was better. The rest had helped, and she walked it in a slow circle twice before mounting to let the soreness work itself out. They were on the trail heading north when the sun cleared the eastern ridge and threw long, cold light across the snow ahead of them. And she looked back once at the way station's low roof, almost invisible under its accumulated snow, and thought about the men who might reach it by nightfall and find the ash still slightly warm in the stove. It would tell them they were close. She turned forward and kept moving. The third day, the trail dropped into a long valley where the snow was thinner and the timber was thick enough to provide real cover, and she began to understand what Vance had meant about the mountain having moods. Because this valley felt different from the exposed pass, felt safer in a way that wasn't entirely rational, but was also not wrong. Animals moved here. She saw deer tracks, the pressed oval signature of snowshoe hair, once the distinctive pattern of a fox trotting along the edge of a frozen creek. She tracked them with her eyes and felt something open up slightly in her chest. Not safety. She was rational enough to know they weren't safe, but something like competence. The slow accumulation of knowledge about how this world worked, learned fast because the alternative was worse. "I see the fox's track from last night," she said, pointing. "Came down the creek and cut east toward the timber." Vance glanced at the track without stopping. "Yesterday morning," he said. "See the edges? Wind softened. Fresh tracks have sharp edges." She looked at them again. He was right. The edges had a faint rounding to them. "Yesterday morning," she repeated. "You'll start seeing it automatically," he said. "Takes time." "We might not have time. You've got more than you think." He didn't say it like reassurance. He said it like a calculation he'd already made. "You've learned more in 3 days than most people do in 3 months." She rode without speaking for a moment. The valley spread wide before them, the creek threading through the snow with the dark line of moving water that hadn't completely frozen yet. Cold, everything cold, but after 3 days her body had established a new baseline, and the cold felt less like an assault than a condition. "Why did you stay in these mountains?" she asked. "All this time alone. You could have gone somewhere else." He didn't answer immediately. She waited, because she'd learned he answered things in his own time, and the wait was usually worth it. "I tried other places," he said finally. "After my mother died, I went to Denver for a year. Then Cheyenne." He was quiet for a few steps. Too many people, and most of them were working hard at pretending they were something different from what they were. He glanced at her sidelong. "Up here, everything is what it is. The mountain doesn't pretend, the cold doesn't pretend." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Takes some getting used to, but it's honest. She thought about Gerald Holt and his 6 months of careful, warm, specific letters. About the way he'd made eye contact at dinner, the way he'd laughed at precisely the right moments. About the skill of the pretense, how much work had gone into making her believe something that had no truth in it anywhere. "I think I understand that," she said. The valley narrowed toward its northern end, and the creek they'd been following bent east and disappeared into a gully, and Vance led them up a slope through thick timber until they came out on a ridge that looked down into a wider country, lower, less dramatic than the pass they'd come through, with the distant suggestion of settlements in the south. "That's the Birch River country," he said. "Iron Creek is 2 days south from the river." She looked at it. 2 more days. "And the men behind us?" He studied the terrain. "If Ashford found the way station this morning, they're half a day back. They'll have to decide whether to push tonight in the dark or camp and lose the time." He calculated it with his eyes on the country. "Ashford will push. He knows every hour they're behind us matters. Then we push too." He looked at her. She held his gaze. "We push too," he agreed. They went down off the ridge into the Birch River country with the last of the afternoon light sliding gold and cold across the snow. And behind them, somewhere in the dark timber of the valley they'd left, the men Silas Harker had sent came on with the patience of men who knew what they were being paid. The Birch River country looked gentler than it was. That was the thing about lower elevation. The softer lines of the terrain, the wider valleys, the timber standing in orderly rows rather than the chaotic wind-bent configurations of the upper ridge. It gave the impression of something managed, something that had made its peace with human presence. But the river itself was only half frozen, running dark and fast beneath a skin of ice that was solid in some places and completely absent in others, and reading which was which required either experience or a willingness to find out the hard way. Vance found the crossing without consulting anything Evelyn could see. No map, no landmarks she recognized. And they crossed in single file on a gravel bar where the water was wide and shallow enough to have frozen solid all the way through. The horses didn't like the ice sound underfoot, but they went, and she kept her weight centered and her eyes forward the way she'd learned on the rock traverse, and they came out the other side with nothing worse than wet boots where the ice had cracked at the edges. On the south bank, he stopped and looked back across the river. "If they push through the night, like I said," he told her, "they'll hit the river around dawn. This crossing, they won't find it without knowing it. Ashford might, but it'll cost him time." "Is there another crossing?" 2 miles west, deeper and slower, but crossable. He studied the far bank a moment longer. "We've got until mid-morning before it doesn't matter anymore." That was the mathematics she was living in now, she'd noticed. Not hours exactly, but relational time, the distance between them and the men behind them, measured in decisions and terrain, and what each party knew that the other didn't. Vance thought in those terms naturally, the way a man thinks in a language he's spoken so long he's stopped translating. She was learning to think that way too, picking up the grammar of it through immersion. They made camp that night on the south side of the river in the shelter of a cut bank where the ground was dry and the overhang above cut the wind. No stove this time. The risk of the light and smell in country this open wasn't worth the warmth. And she sat wrapped in the bedroll with her back against the cut bank wall, and ate cold hardtack and dried meat, and found that she wasn't miserable about it, which seemed worth noting. Vance sat nearby, cleaning the rifle by feel in the dark with the ease of someone who'd done it enough times that his hands knew the process independently of his eyes. She watched the shape of him work in the dark. "Tell me something about Iron Creek," she said. "What are we walking into?" He ran the cleaning rod through the barrel. "Boomtown, silver money mostly. There are 3 operating mines in the hills above the valley. Population maybe 2,000, growing. Enough law to keep it from being completely lawless, not enough to keep it honest." He paused. "Federal Land Office is on the main street, same building as the Postal Service." "Will they be watching it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Harker has had 2 years to build relationships in this territory. Iron Creek is where the money moves, so yes, he has eyes there." He set the rifle across his knees. "The question is whether those eyes extend to the federal office specifically. Federal officials are harder to buy than territorial ones." "Harder isn't the same as impossible." "No," he said, "it's not." She thought about this. "We can't walk in openly." "We can't walk in together openly," he said. "You go in. I cover the street." He said it like it was simple, and she understood that for him it was the natural division of a problem into its components. The federal registrar takes the claim, stamps it, logs it in the federal record. That process takes about 10 minutes, and once it's done, it can't be undone without a federal court order, which takes months and requires actual legal grounds. And while I'm in the office, I'm outside making sure no one goes in behind you. She thought about what making sure meant in his vocabulary and decided not to examine it too closely. How many men does Harker have in Iron Creek? I don't know exactly. My best guess is 2 or 3 permanent, men watching for situations like this. The ones following us are his field crew. If they get to Iron Creek before we finish what we need to do— He stopped. Then it gets complicated, she finished. Yes. She looked up at the cut bank above them. The sky was clear, and the stars were the same hard, clear stars she'd been falling asleep under for 4 nights now. And she was starting to recognize specific ones, the patterns Vance had pointed out on the second night when she'd asked him how he navigated in the dark. She found the cluster he'd called the Hunter's Belt and used it to place north the way he'd shown her, and the small competence of that, of knowing exactly where north was in the dark and unfamiliar country, did something for her that was hard to name. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "You do it loud." She looked at him. In the dark, she could just make out his face, the angle of his jaw, the pale glint of his eyes. He wasn't quite smiling, but there was something in the set of his mouth that was close to it. "What does that mean?" "You get a particular look when you're working something out. Your jaw goes a certain way." He said it without any edge to it, just observation. "What are you thinking about?" "Even after the registration," she said. "Harker doesn't stop. The registration protects the claim legally. It doesn't protect me." He was quiet. "He's already tried to erase me once," she said. "The marriage scheme. That was meant to be clean. Transfer the claim legally, and I just disappear into whatever frontier life he'd arranged for me. Or worse." She pulled the bedroll tighter. "Once the claim is registered in my name federally, I'm a loose end that can talk. I know what he did. I know about Holt. I know about the scheme." "You'd need to make that information dangerous for him to act on," Vance said. He'd already been where her thinking was going, she could tell. "Not just registered, documented, witnessed." "A federal marshal," she said. "If I file a complaint with a federal marshal about the fraudulent marriage and the attempt to steal the claim, it becomes a federal matter. Harker's operation is territorial. He can manage territorial law. Federal law is different. It's not simple," he said carefully. "You'd need evidence beyond your testimony. The judge, Calver, he witnessed the ceremony. Holt is presumably still in Blackstone Ridge. Holt will deny everything." "Yes, but Calver is a different calculation. He's a territorial judge performing a ceremony that a federal investigation would look at closely. If a federal marshal starts asking questions in Blackstone Ridge, Calver has to decide how much he's willing to risk for Harker." He thought about it. "A man like Calver, he's bought, but he's not loyal. There's a difference." She'd seen that difference her whole life. The bought ones always had a number where they'd switch sides, and the skill was finding the right moment to make the offer. So Calver could be turned, with the right pressure and the right sequence. He picked up the rifle again, not to clean it, but just to have it in his hands, which she'd noticed was something he did when he was thinking hard. File the claim, file the complaint, do them simultaneously so Harker doesn't have time to react to the first before the second is in motion. "Can we do both at once? Federal Land Office and Federal Marshal's Office?" "Iron Creek has both," he said. "On the same street, as it happens." Something moved in his voice that wasn't quite humor, but was adjacent to it. Small mercies. She let out a long breath. The plan had shape now. It wasn't perfect. She was rational enough to know that plans that had to be executed in hostile territory against men with more resources and local knowledge were never going to be perfect. But it had the right structure. Move fast, move simultaneously, put enough legal weight behind her position that destroying her became more dangerous than leaving her alone. "All right," she said. "That's the plan. Try to sleep," he said. "We need to make good time tomorrow." She closed her eyes. Behind them she could hear the river moving in the dark, the sound it made where it ran over gravel beneath the ice. A low, continuous rush that was almost like quiet. She focused on it, filed it in the growing catalog of mountain sounds she was building in her memory, because she was learning that the unfamiliar became less frightening once you'd named it. Sleep came. She didn't hear Vance get up twice during the night to check the perimeter, though he did. The fourth day the weather turned on them in the afternoon. It came from the northwest the way the hard weather always seemed to come in this country. And the first sign of it was the specific quality of the light, a yellowish flatness that Vance had pointed out on day 2 as meaning something was building. She recognized it now when she saw it and looked at him, and he looked at the sky and said, 3 hours, maybe 4. They pushed the pace. The bay was fully recovered from the traverse soreness and moved well on the lower elevation ground, and she didn't have to nurse it the way she'd been doing since day 2. Vance set a pace that was harder than the previous days, and she matched it, and the country moved past. Frozen meadows, creek crossings, the occasional weathered fence post from some abandoned homestead attempt that made her think about her father's farmhouse in Millhaven and the way it had looked in the winter light when she'd left it for the last time. She didn't want to think about that. She thought about Iron Creek instead, about the federal land office, about the registrar's stamp on the bottom of her father's claim form, making it finally, formally, irrevocably hers. The storm hit them about 2 miles short of a settlement Vance had been aiming for. A small collection of buildings called Ridgeton that sat at the confluence of 2 creeks and had, according to him, a livery stable and a boarding house and a woman named Patterson who'd put travelers up for the night without asking many questions. The storm didn't hit gradually. It arrived like a door slamming, the wind going from nothing to something violent in the space of about 30 seconds, driving snow horizontally and dropping the visibility to about 20 feet. The horses pushed into it with their heads down, and she pressed her face against the bay's neck and kept one hand on the mane and trusted Vance's gray to stay in front of her, which it did. She couldn't see him. She could see his horse's hindquarters and nothing else. She focused on that. Just that. The gray's hindquarters moving through the white. They rode like that for what felt like a very long time. Her face went numb on the side exposed to the wind. The snow packed into every gap in her clothing. The sound was enormous. The wind in the trees, the creak of branches, the continuous hiss of driven snow against everything solid. And under it she couldn't hear the horse's feet, couldn't hear anything except the storm and her own breathing. Then the gray stopped. She pulled up the bay. Vance was off his horse, leading it by the bridle toward something she could barely make out through the blowing snow. A dark shape, a structure, the orange glow of a window. Ridgeton. She got down. Her legs were stiff and wrong from the cold, and she stumbled when she hit the ground, but caught the stirrup and held herself up and followed him. The livery was warm in the way that animal spaces are warm. Body heat and hay smell, and the deep particular warmth of a space that had been holding it for a long time. A boy of about 14 took the horses without being asked and began stripping their tack with the efficient movements of someone who'd been doing it since he could reach the saddle. Vance spoke to someone in the office at the back. Money changed hands. He came back with a key. The boarding house was across the frozen mud of the main road. 2 rooms. He took one, she took the other, and when the door closed behind her, she stood in the center of a small room with a bed and a washstand and a window that the storm was hammering. And she peeled off her outer layers and found her hands were shaking, and her face was just beginning to hurt as the feeling came back. There was a basin with water. She washed her hands and face with water that was cold but not frozen, and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked different, not dramatically, not the transformation of a dime novel heroine, not something you could point to and name in a single word, but different. Her face was leaner, weathered in a new way, the skin around her eyes tighter from days of squinting against snow glare. There were shadows under her eyes that weren't entirely from the last 4 days of poor sleep. And something in the set of her mouth had changed, had settled into something that had less give in it than it used to. She'd looked in mirrors her whole life and seen a woman who was trying to manage situations she hadn't chosen. She didn't see that now. She saw someone who was moving towards something on purpose. It wasn't comfortable, exactly, but it was honest. She ate dinner in the boarding house's small common room. Real food, hot food, a bowl of bean soup and bread that was actual bread. Sitting across the table from Vance and a traveling merchant named Oberst, who was waiting out the storm and talked about freight prices for 20 minutes before reading the room correctly and going to bed. Alone at the table, she and Vance sat with their coffee and the fire in the corner and the storm noise outside. "One day," he said. "Tomorrow we reach Iron Creek." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "If the storm clears, it'll clear by morning. This kind doesn't last." She believed him. She'd stopped second-guessing his weather reads on day 2. and the men behind us. He looked at the fire. The storm slows them the same way it slows us. They're in the open country north of the river right now, probably. Rough night. Something in his voice was flat and certain. But Ashford won't stop. He'll push his crew through and he'll lose time, but not as much as we'd want. She thought about Burl Ashford, whom she'd never met, moving through the same storm they'd just come through, pushing men who probably wanted to stop, driving them forward because he was being paid to solve a problem that was one day ahead of him. "He'll reach Iron Creek before we finish," she said. "Probably." Vance looked at her. "It means we move fast once we're in town. No settling in, no waiting to see what the land looks like. We go straight to the federal offices. Together or separately?" He thought about it. "I go in first, check what's on the street, come back to you." He paused. "The men Harker keeps in Iron Creek. I know one of them by sight. If he's visible, we adjust. And if we can't adjust..." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm pushed at the walls. "We adjust anyway," he said. "There's no version of tomorrow where we don't finish this." She looked at him across the table. 4 days ago, he'd been a stranger in a frozen alley handing her work gloves. She still didn't know all of what he was, the full shape of him, the particular damage and particular integrity of a man who'd lived alone in the mountains for years by deliberate choice. But she knew the part that mattered for right now. He meant exactly what he said, every time he said it, and he didn't say things he didn't mean. That was rarer than it should have been. "Why are you doing this?" she said. Not the version of the question she'd asked in the alley, that one he'd answered. This was a different version. "You could have put me on the trail to Iron Creek and gone back to your line, given me the map and walked away. What you're risking? Stop," he said. Not unkindly, just a stop. She stopped. He turned his coffee cup on the table. A slow rotation, twice around, his eyes on it rather than her. "I spent 2 years watching Harker take things from people and finding reasons why it wasn't my fight," he said. "I've got a list of those reasons. They're all technically valid." He looked up. "I'm tired of valid reasons." She held his gaze. "Also," he said, and there was something different in his voice now, something quieter and less armored. "You threw a water glass at a man who had 2 friends in the room and was twice your size. I respected that." She felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a long time. It was a poor tactical decision. "Terrible," he agreed. "Completely ineffective." "I didn't even hit him properly." "You hit him some." She almost laughed. She actually laughed, a short one, surprised out of her, and it sounded strange in the small room after 4 days of concentrated survival, thin and real and slightly rusty, like something that hadn't been used in a while. He almost smiled. The almost smile was something she'd come to recognize as the full version for him, and she'd stopped waiting for it to become more than it was. She went to bed. She slept better than any night on the trail, which might have been the real bed or might have been something else. The particular rest that came from knowing tomorrow had a shape, and the shape had been agreed on. The storm cleared by 3 in the morning. By 5, the sky was that specific clean black of post-storm winter dark, with stars so bright they seemed closer than usual. By 6, Vance was knocking on her door. She was already dressed. They rode out of Ridgeton in the early morning, with the snow brilliant and unbroken ahead of them, and the mountains behind them still holding the last of the dark. And the country between them and Iron Creek was 30 miles of rolling river terrain that in summer would have been pleasant traveling. In winter, it was open and exposed, and the wind moved across it without interruption. They moved at a pace that said they had somewhere specific to be. Around mid-morning, she saw, for the first time, the smoke of a settlement on the horizon, the collective smoke of 2,000 people's fires combining into a smudge against the cold blue sky. Iron Creek. She could see why it had grown. The valley it occupied was protected on 3 sides by ridges, with the river providing water and the hills above providing the silver that provided everything else. She thought about the men behind them, about Ashford and however many he had pushing south through the same post-storm snow, about the men already in Iron Creek who worked for Harker's permanent operation, about a land office on the main street in 10 minutes and a stamp on a form. "Colton," she said. He glanced at her. She hadn't used his name before, she realized. She'd been calling him Vance for 4 days. "If this goes wrong today," she said. Not as a prediction, just as the thing that needed saying before they rode into a situation where saying it afterward might not be possible. I want you to know that what you did. She stopped. She wasn't good at this, the direct declaration of things. Her father hadn't been either. It was a family trait of a kind. It mattered, she said finally. What you did mattered. He looked at her for a moment. The pale gray eyes and the rough weathered face and the long practiced stillness of a man who'd spent years having no one to say things to. It's not going to go wrong, he said. I know, but if it does. He nodded. A single nod, acknowledging the weight of what she'd said without making it into more than she'd meant. Same, he said, just the one word. But she heard everything in it. They rode toward the smoke on the horizon. Iron Creek appeared gradually over the last rise. First the outer buildings, the livery and the freight yard, and the rough structures that accumulated at the edges of any town that was growing faster than it was planning. Then the main street with its 2- and 3-story buildings, and the wide frozen mud of the thoroughfare, and the signs and the people moving, and the general noise and smell of a concentrated human settlement after days of mountain silence. She hadn't been in a town in almost a week. The density of it was briefly disorienting. The number of faces, the sound of multiple conversations at distance, the movement and complexity of people going about the ordinary business of a frontier boomtown on a cold morning. Vance pulled up at the edge of the main street. She came up beside him. He looked at the street with the particular quality of attention she'd watched him apply to every landscape they'd moved through, reading it the same way he read mountain terrain, the exits, the sightlines, the positions and purposes of what was visible. There, he said, quiet. He indicated a man standing outside a hardware store about halfway down the street, not quite doing anything, positioned in a way that let him see in both directions. A man with no obvious purpose who was watching all the same. That's Harker's man. Name's Decker. She looked at him once and away. Does he know you? He knows my face. Does he know mine? Vance looked at her. She was wearing the canvas coat still, the one that was his. Her hair was up under a heavy hat she'd borrowed from the boarding house's Lost and Found. In the coat and hat she read as neither one thing nor another. Not the woman who'd stepped off the train in Blackstone Ridge in a gray dress. Maybe not at first look, he said. Then I go down the street, normal pace. He's looking for a woman with a man, looking for us together, not a woman alone. She looked at the Federal Land Office sign she could just make out 3/4 of the way down the street. You stay here, I go. If he moves, I'll handle it, Vance said. His voice had changed, flattened, the same way it had on the mountain when he was talking about something operational and not personal. Move like you belong here. Don't look at the land office until you're almost at the door. I know, she said, and she did. She'd been learning for 4 days from a man who knew how to move through dangerous terrain. A main street was just another kind of terrain. She straightened her hat, checked that the bag was secure across her body, the false bottom holding what it needed to hold. Then she rode down the main street of Iron Creek like she had somewhere to be. She kept her eyes forward and her pace steady, and she did not look at the Federal Land Office until she was close enough to read the small print on the door. The main street of Iron Creek was busy enough on a post-storm morning that one woman on horseback moving at a normal pace drew no particular attention. Freight wagons were moving. Men were shoveling the boardwalk in front of their businesses. 2 women in heavy coats were standing outside the dry goods store talking about something that made one of them laugh. The ordinary machinery of a frontier town running its ordinary morning, indifferent to her and everything she was carrying. She passed Decker at 20 feet without looking at him directly. She caught him in her peripheral vision, a heavy-set man in a brown coat, positioned exactly the way Vance had said, doing the particular nothing of someone being paid to watch. He glanced at her and glanced away. One woman alone on a tired horse did not match whatever description he'd been given. She reached the land office door and dismounted and went in. The Federal Land Office smelled of paper and coal heat and the particular staleness of a government space. A clerk sat behind a counter that had seen years of elbows, with stacks of ledgers behind him and a shelf of official-looking stamps in a wooden rack to his right. He was perhaps 50, bespectacled, with the air of a man who had processed an enormous number of human problems in this room and had arrived at a professional equanimity about all of them. He looked up when she came in. "Help you?" "I need to re-register a federal mineral claim," she said. She kept her voice level. Lapsed at the holder's death. I'm the heir. He studied her for a moment with the professional assessment of someone who'd seen fraudulent claims and genuine ones and had developed a sense for the difference. Documentation? She opened the bag, reached beneath the false bottom, laid the claim on the counter. He picked it up and carried it to the window, holding it up to the light the way the man at the Millhaven land office had done. He looked at it for a long time. She stood still and counted her own heartbeats and did not rush him. William Hart, he said, filed 3 years ago. My father, he passed 18 months ago. The renewal lapsed because I didn't know it was required. You have proof of death and inheritance? She laid out the 2 documents she'd been carrying folded behind the claim, the death record from the county office in Millhaven and the handwritten testament her father had left with the local judge, witnessed by 2 men who'd since moved on but whose signatures were there. She'd carried these since the beginning. She'd carried them because her father had been careful enough to make them, and she'd been careful enough to keep them. The clerk took his time with each one. The bell above the door opened behind her. She didn't turn around. Miss? The clerk had looked up. He was looking past her, at whoever had come in. I'll just be a moment, a voice said from behind her. Pleasant, patient. The voice of a man who was used to waiting because he knew he was going to get what he was waiting for. She turned. He wasn't what she'd expected. Silas Harker was perhaps 55, trim, well-dressed in a dark coat that cost more than most men in this territory earned in a month. His face was clean-shaved and even-featured, with cold, dark eyes that moved across her with the comprehensive assessment of a man who had spent a career determining the value of things quickly. He was alone, which surprised her for exactly 1 second before she understood it. A man like Harker didn't do things with witnesses he didn't control. Behind him, through the glass of the door, she could see the street. She could not see Vance. Mrs. Holt, Harker said. He said it pleasantly, the way you might greet a business acquaintance at a social occasion. My name is Evelyn Hart, she said. Legally, it isn't. He came to the counter and stood beside her, close but not threatening in any physical sense, and that was the precision of him. He didn't need physical threat. His threat was the architecture of legal and financial and organizational power he'd built, and he wore it the way other men wore good coats. The territorial marriage statute is quite clear. I have the documentation here if the registrar would like to see it. The clerk had gone still behind the counter. He was looking between them with the expression of a man trying to determine whether this was above his pay grade, which it was. The marriage was performed under fraudulent pretenses, Evelyn said. She kept her voice even. Mr. Holt misrepresented himself in written correspondence over 6 months specifically to access this claim through territorial marriage law. That constitutes fraud. A serious allegation, Harker said. One that would require substantial proof and considerable time in territorial courts to adjudicate. He smiled. Not warmly, not coldly, just precisely. Time during which I'm afraid the claim would be in legal limbo, unregistrable by either party. She understood what he was doing. He wasn't here to take the claim by force. Not in a federal office, not in a town with enough law to make that complicated. He was here to create a procedural knot, to introduce enough legal uncertainty that the registrar would decline to process the re-registration until the territorial dispute was resolved, which, in a territorial court where Harker had relationships, could take as long as he needed it to take. He'd thought further ahead than she'd anticipated. Not all the way ahead, but further. The clerk had the documents in hand when you came in, she said, to the clerk now rather than to Harker. The federal claim predates the territorial marriage statute being applied to mineral rights. The federal claim is in my father's name, inherited by me under federal inheritance law. The territorial marriage has no jurisdiction over a federally registered claim. You know that. The clerk blinked behind his spectacles. He looked at the documents in his hand. He was not a stupid man. She'd assessed that in the first 30 seconds. He was a careful man, a man who survived in a government position in a frontier territory by not making enemies, and right now she was asking him to make one. The question of jurisdictional precedence between federal and territorial law, Harker said to the clerk gently, is something that would properly be decided by the territorial. The door opened again. The man who came in was not Vance. He was broad-shouldered and unhurried, and he wore a badge on his coat that caught the light from the window. He was perhaps 40, with a marshal's careful eyes that had developed the habit of seeing the whole room before they settled on any one part of it. He looked at Evelyn, then at Harker, then at the clerk. "Morning," he said to the general room. Then to Harker specifically, "Mr. Harker, I've been hoping to run into you." Harker's expression didn't change. "Marshal Cade." "Got a telegraph this morning from Blackstone Ridge." The marshal moved to the counter and stood on Harker's other side, which put Harker between them with a neatness that didn't look accidental. "Judge Calver down there has had a change of heart about a marriage ceremony he performed 6 days ago. Apparently he'd like to speak with a federal representative about the circumstances." The precise smile on Harker's face held for a moment. Then it changed. Not dramatically, just a slight tightening, the first visible sign that something had moved underneath the controlled surface. Evelyn thought, Calver, the bought man who wasn't loyal, who had a number where he'd switched sides. Someone had found that number. Someone had made the offer. She looked at the door. Through the glass she could now see the street, and she could see Vance standing at the edge of the boardwalk across the road. And beside him, a thin man she didn't know who had the particular posture of someone who'd just delivered something and was waiting to see what it did. She looked back at the marshal. "I filed a written complaint this morning," she said to him, "at the marshal's office on the north end of the street. Fraudulent misrepresentation, conspiracy to commit property theft, and 1 count of false imprisonment." She said it steadily, each item like a stone being set in a wall. A copy went to the federal district office by telegraph. Harker turned to look at her. Really look at her, for the first time. Not the assessment of a man looking at a problem to be managed, but something closer to surprise. And underneath the surprise, the first real thing she'd seen from him, which was a cold and genuine anger. "You came in this morning?" he said. "I came in an hour ago," she said, "while you were still watching the South Road." He'd been expecting them from the south, the direction Ashford and his men were pushing from. He'd been watching the wrong road because she and Vance had taken the Ridgeton route, which came in from the west, which Ashford had not known because Ashford knew the mountain routes, but not all of them, and Vance had known the one that mattered. Harker looked at the marshal. "I want to speak with my lawyer." "That's your right," Cade said. He said it without any satisfaction in it, just as a plain fact. "Gerald Holt is already in the marshal's office. He came in voluntarily, which I mentioned because it's relevant to how cooperative he's being. Holt. Voluntary." She thought about that. Holt had looked at the same calculus Calver had looked at and made the same calculation. That the architecture Harker had built was cracking under federal pressure, and the first man to step to the other side of it got the best deal. She had no sympathy for him, but she understood him, which was a different thing. "Mr. Harker," the marshal said, not unkindly, "I'd appreciate it if you came with me." Harker straightened his coat. He looked at Evelyn one more time, and she held his gaze without anything in her face that wasn't calm. And after a moment he looked away first, which she would remember later as the moment the thing was actually over. He walked out of the land office ahead of the marshal. Through the glass she watched them cross the street. She watched Vance watch them cross. She watched the tension in his shoulders change when the marshal's office door closed behind them. Then she turned back to the clerk. He was looking at her over his spectacles with an expression that had moved from careful neutrality into something closer to frank assessment. "I believe," she said, "you were looking at those documents." He looked down at his hands, at the claim, the death record, the testament. He set them side by side on the counter and looked at them for a moment. "The federal inheritance is clear," he said. "And you're right about jurisdictional precedents. A federally filed mineral claim predating a territorial statute can't be superseded by that statute." He picked up a pen. "I'll need your signature in 3 places." She signed in 3 places. Her hand was steady. She was distantly surprised by that. The stamp came down on the registration form with the solid sound of something being made permanent. He entered it in the ledger. He gave her the stamped copy and kept the original. "That's registered," he said. "As of today. Federal record." She looked at the stamped document in her hands. Her father's cramped, careful handwriting on the registration line, his signature. And now the federal stamp and the date and the registrar's initials, making it the thing it had always been meant to be, just 20 years late, and at a cost her father hadn't had to pay because she'd paid it instead. She folded it along its original lines, tucked it back into the bag, not the false bottom this time. There was no need for false bottoms anymore. She walked out of the land office into the cold main street of Iron Creek. Vance was there. He'd crossed while she was inside, and he was standing at the hitching post with both horses, and he looked at her face when she came out, and whatever he read there made something release in him, visible in the set of his shoulders and a long, slow breath that came out white in the cold air. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. He nodded. He handed her the bay's reins. She took them, and they stood there for a moment on the main street of a boom town in the winter light. Two people who'd crossed a mountain together and come out the other side. And neither of them said anything because neither of them had a good word for what the moment was. "Ashford and his crew are going to reach town by this afternoon," he said finally. "The marshal knows about them. I included it in the complaint." She looked down the street. "Without Harker, they're just men who are following orders from someone who's being held on federal charges. Without the land claim as an objective, there's nothing for them to do here. Ashford doesn't like loose ends. Neither do I." She looked at him. "But the federal marshal likes them even less." He almost smiled at that. The almost smile she'd stopped waiting to become more than it was. They led the horses away from the hitching post and down a side street toward the livery, and the town moved around them with its ordinary noise and its extraordinary indifference. And she thought about what the clerk had said. That's registered, as of today, and how the word today carried the full weight of every day that had preceded it. She thought about what came next, which she'd been deliberately not thinking about during the 6 days of the mountain crossing because there was no point thinking about what came next when what came now was still trying to kill you. But now what came now was over, and what came next was a real question with real options in it. The land on the eastern ridge of Blackstone Territory was hers, federally registered, legally incontestable, carrying a silver deposit that the survey team had been taking core samples from last spring. She was on paper potentially one of the wealthier people in this territory. She had not yet absorbed what that meant because it still had the abstract quality of something that hadn't connected to her life yet. What she did know was this. She was sitting in a livery stable in Iron Creek with her feet on solid ground for the first time in 6 days, and the man across the stable aisle was rubbing down the gray horse with a burlap sack and not saying anything. And the ordinary physical fact of that, of him being there, moving and quiet and real, was something she wanted to look at for a moment before it became something she had to make a decision about. "What do you do now?" she said. "Your cabin is gone. Your trap line." He kept working on the horse. "The cabin's probably still standing. Harker's men found it empty. They didn't need to burn it. And if they did?" He was quiet for a moment. "I've built things before." He said it like this was simply a fact about him, which it was. She watched him work. "I'm going to need to develop the claim. That requires capital and expertise I don't have and people I don't know." She paused. "It also requires someone who knows that mountain better than anyone Harker hired, which is a shorter list." He stopped working on the horse and looked at her. "I'm not offering you a job," she said before he could misread the direction. "I'm saying that what happens on that land next is going to require exactly the kind of person who knows what you know. And I'd rather it be you than someone I don't trust yet." He was quiet for a long moment. The gray shifted under his hands and he steadied it without looking away from her. "As what?" he said. Not wary, just precise, the way he was about everything. "As whatever makes sense," she said. "Partner, if that's the right word. I don't know yet what the right word is." He looked at her for a long time with those pale gray eyes that she'd learned to read. Somewhat. Not fully, probably not ever fully, but enough to see that what was moving behind them right now wasn't reluctance. "I'd need to winter at the cabin first," he said. "Check the line. Make sure the property is clear." "That's reasonable. And I'm not a mining man. I know the terrain. I don't know what to do with a silver deposit. I'll hire mining men. That part I can learn." She met his eyes. "The terrain part I can't learn fast enough without you." He turned back to the horse. He worked in silence for a moment, and she let him, because she'd learned that silence from him wasn't refusal. It was processing. The deliberate way he handled decisions that mattered, turning them in his hands before he committed. "All right," he said. 2 words. The same 2 words she'd said to him in a frozen alley in Blackstone Ridge, when he'd pointed north and told her he had a cabin 12 miles away, and the rest of her options were worse. She heard the echo of it, and she thought he probably did too. "All right," she said back. They stayed in Iron Creek 3 days, which was how long it took for the federal marshal's preliminary proceedings against Harker to be formalized, for Evelyn's testimony to be recorded by a federal clerk in a room that smelled of the same coal heat and old paper as the land office, for the legal machinery to achieve enough momentum that it couldn't be stopped by anything short of a federal circuit court intervention that Harker's lawyer hadn't managed to arrange yet, and according to Marshal Cade, was unlikely to. Holt's cooperation turned out to be more complete than she'd expected. The specifics of the scheme, the 6 months of letters, the territorial statute, the arrangement with Judge Calver, the plan for what happened to Evelyn after the transfer was complete, all of it was on record by the second day. Cade told her this in the particular neutral tone of an official conveying information without editorializing, and she sat with it and felt the cold, specific anger of knowing exactly how close she'd come. And then she put it away, not because it didn't matter, but because carrying it wasn't useful anymore. On the second evening, she went to the telegraph office and sent a message to the mining attorney in St. Louis, whose name the federal registrar had given her, a man who specialized in exactly this kind of land development, who would know the next steps in a way she couldn't yet. The reply came the following morning. Interested, available, could be in Iron Creek within the month. She stood at the telegraph office counter reading the reply and felt, for the first time, the weight of what she was actually holding. Not the fear of losing it, which had been her relationship with the claim for the past week. The actual weight of having it. Her father had bet on something with nothing to back it up except his own stubbornness and a surveyor friend's quiet opinion. And he'd been right. And he'd died before he knew he was right. That was the part she'd carry longest. Not with bitterness, she hoped, but with the particular obligation that came from inheriting something that had cost someone else everything. She was going to do something with it, something that meant the cost had been worth it. She didn't know the full shape of that yet, but she knew she was going to find out. On the morning of the fourth day, they rode north, not back through the Calder Pass. There was no reason to punish themselves or the horses with the high route when the valley roads were open. They went west first, then north along the river road, through country that was hard and cold and plain, and asked nothing of them except to keep moving, which they did. She was better at riding than she'd been a week ago. Her body had learned the mountain way of sitting a horse, the constant small adjustments, the weight distribution for slopes, the way you gave the animal its head on uncertain footing and kept your own center wherever it needed to be. She hadn't been taught this exactly. She'd absorbed it through a week of doing it because stopping wasn't an option, which was, she was beginning to think, how most things worth knowing actually got learned. They didn't talk a great deal on the ride north. They'd never been great talkers, either of them, which was part of what had made the 6 days across the mountain work as well as it had. They talked when there was something to say and rode quietly when there wasn't, and the quiet between them had the quality of quiet between people who don't need to fill it. On the second evening of the ride north, camped beside the river with a real fire, because there was no one following them anymore, and the night was deep cold and the fire was worth the risk of nothing, she said, I keep thinking about what you said, about leaving Denver because people were working hard at pretending to be something they weren't. He looked at her across the fire. What about it? I did that for 6 months. Read letters from a man who didn't exist and built a picture of a future from them. She looked at the fire. I knew something was wrong in Calver's office before anything happened. Knew it as a feeling I couldn't name. I went ahead anyway because I didn't have a better option, and I didn't trust the feeling enough. And now? Now I think the feeling was the most honest thing in the room. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. I'd been so careful to be practical and rational about the whole thing, checking what I could check, asking the questions you could ask without seeming suspicious, and the thing that was actually right was the one I couldn't substantiate. He was quiet for a moment. That's not irrational, he said. That's pattern recognition. You've been reading situations your whole life. You read that one correctly. You just didn't have enough backing to act on it yet. She looked at him. Is that what you tell yourself about the family you watched leave? That you didn't have enough backing? He held her gaze. I tell myself I didn't act and people paid for it, he said evenly. I don't dress it up. She nodded. That was the difference between them. Maybe he punished himself with accuracy, and she'd been punishing herself with doubt. Neither approach was entirely healthy, but honest was better than the alternative. The fire burned down slow and red. The river moved in the dark beside them, under its ice skin, going somewhere south. The horses were quiet. The sky above was immense and clear and populated with every star the cold could conjure. My father used to say that land doesn't lie to you, she said. People lie. Markets lie. Luck lies. Land is what it is. He wasn't wrong. No. She looked north, in the direction of the mountain they'd come from, which was invisible in the dark but present. She could feel the shape of it against the sky, the particular darkness of high terrain against the slightly lesser darkness of stars. He wasn't wrong about most things. He was just too early. Vance was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're not." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, not at her, and the way he'd said it, plain, certain, not as comfort, but as assessment, landed the same way all his assessments landed, like something that had been measured before being spoken. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. They reached Blackstone Ridge 6 days after leaving Iron Creek, coming in from the west road in the gray morning light, and she rode down the main street of the town that had tried to erase her and looked at it with eyes that had crossed a mountain and registered a federal claim and watched a man like Silas Harker run out of moves. The street looked smaller than she remembered. The buildings still leaned on each other. The saloon sign still hung at its drunk angle. She didn't stop. They rode through and out the north end of town and up into the foothills, and the mountain came back around them slowly, the way it always did. The air changing, the sound changing, the particular quality of silence that she'd hated at first, and had learned, somewhere in the 6 days of crossing it, to recognize as the sound of something that was simply itself without apology. The cabin was standing. The door had been forced, and one shutter was broken, but the structure was solid and the stove was intact and the wood cache under the canvas was untouched. Vance went through it with the methodical attention of someone assessing damage and making a list, and she stood in the center of the main room and looked at the shelves with their organized provisions and the gun rack and the traps hanging from the pegs. This was where the story had started, really, not in Calver's office or on the platform at Blackstone Ridge Station. Here, with two people who didn't know each other sitting across a table in the firelight, trying to figure out whether the other could be trusted. She thought they'd both made the right call. The stove was going within an hour. Coffee was on. Outside, the mountain held its cold and its silence, and its complete indifference to human problems, which was, she'd decided, actually one of its better qualities. She sat at the table with the coffee and the stamped land registration and the letter from the St. Louis attorney folded in her coat pocket, and she thought about what her father had said. Land is what it is. What it was a silver deposit on an eastern ridge in Blackstone Territory, registered in the name of Evelyn Hart, heir to William Hart, valid under federal law and on record in Iron Creek and in the federal district office, and in the memory of a federal registrar who would be very difficult to intimidate. What it was going to be was something she'd have to build from the ground up, in difficult country, with inadequate information and insufficient capital and the inevitable complications of trying to do something real in a place where powerful people had preferred that nothing real get done. She was looking forward to it. Not because it would be easy. Nothing about what was ahead was going to be easy, and she was done trading in the comfortable fiction that ease was a reasonable thing to expect from a life lived honestly. Her father had worked 20 years on hard ground for a return he never saw. She'd crossed a mountain in winter with nothing but $9 and a piece of paper and the stubbornness to not let go of either. What she'd learned, in the particular compressed way that hard weeks teach hard lessons, was that the thing that kept you moving when everything else failed wasn't optimism, and it wasn't courage exactly. Those were words people used from the outside. From the inside, it was simpler and less glamorous. It was just the refusal to stop. The decision, made over and over in small moments, to take the next step because the alternative was to become the thing they'd tried to make her. A woman who'd been used and discarded and had accepted that that was the end of her story. She hadn't accepted it. She didn't intend to. Vance came back inside from checking the lean-to and sat across the table from her, and she pushed the second coffee cup toward him, and he wrapped his hands around it, and the fire worked in the stove, and the mountain held them inside its enormous cold silence. Outside, the eastern ridge caught the first morning light, silver light, which seemed appropriate coming across country that was finally, formally, irrevocably hers. She drank her coffee. The story was not over, in the way that real stories are never over. There would be lawyers and complications, and men who tried other angles and seasons that were harder than expected, and decisions she'd make wrong and have to unmake. There would be mornings she didn't know what she was doing, and nights she wasn't sure it was worth the cost. But she was here. She was not erased. Her father's name was on a federal document in Iron Creek, and her name was on it below his, and no one was going to take that now. That was enough to start with. That was more than enough.